My name is Rebecca. I'm 36 years old, and I'm a doctor. I work hard, constantly on the move between meetings, ward responsibilities, and sometimes on call shifts. It's part of my life that I love to always be in demand, to constantly be called to new challenges, to be the one who makes things happen. I've always seen myself as a career person, someone who doesn't settle for a mediocre life, but who strives upward. My parents pushed me in the same direction. They taught me that nothing is impossible if you're willing to work hard, and that motto has followed me ever since. Of course, this whole setup includes my husband, Daniel. Daniel and I got married right after I completed my internship, ATT Genst. It was a hectic time, but he was so understanding. He saw me as a star, someone worthy of admiration. I enjoyed that attention. I love feeling admired. Initially, it wasn't that I looked down on him. I was just so incredibly grateful for his role. He did everything so I could focus on my career, and it was a dream for me. To have a husband by my side who didn't criticize my long workdays or question my priorities. When I look back, it's hard to recall that time without feeling a certain nostalgia. A time when I truly believed we had found the perfect balance. Me in my forward-rushing, ambitious world, and him as a steady pillar at home. But then our daughter Ava came along. That was 4 years ago. Daniel became a stay-at-home dad quite early on, even though he first worked a bit from home in a half-hearted way. I guess it was mostly to keep some kind of professional identity alive. But then he quit entirely. It was almost my suggestion from the start, and he jumped on it right away. I'm trying to remember how I felt at that time. I remember being thankful because I didn't have to worry about who would pick up Ava, who would do the laundry, who would fix dinner. Everything fell to Daniel, and he did it without the slightest complaint. In hindsight, I can see that he probably liked feeling needed and getting to spend time with our daughter. But I can't help admitting that for me, it was self-evident that he would take care of all that. I was the one with the real career, the one who brought in the money, the one who worked for our family's livelihood. Surely he could at least make sure the household was running. In the beginning, it was pure delight. I never even had to think about household chores. I could get up early, go to work, and know that Ava was well cared for at home, that dinner was on the table when I got back, that the laundry was folded and the closets properly restocked. I didn't have to worry about grocery shopping, booking dental appointments, or planning weekend activities. Daniel did everything. But slowly, I began to notice a change in my own mindset. The more successful I felt, the more attention I got at the hospital, the more I began to view Daniel's role as less valuable is a harsh term, but it might not be far from what I actually thought back then. I realized that whenever I thought of him and what he did all day, I got a negative feeling in my gut. As if household work and parenting were something trivial, something that didn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. I hear my own thoughts as I formulate them in my head. How hard can it be to stay home with a child and take care of the household? I know plenty of other men who work full-time and still manage to be parents. Plenty of women, like myself, work full-time, often more than that, and still find time to cook dinner sometimes. So why is Daniel's contribution so remarkable? The more praise I got at work, the more he sank in my eyes. The fact that he didn't even have the ambition to try anything other than being a stay-at-home dad started to irritate me. I remember rolling my eyes when he wanted to talk about his day. Today, Ava and I went to the park. We met Sarah and her daughter. Then we did some shopping. In secret, I sighed and thought, oh God, how trivial. Is that all you have to talk about? All of this might have fizzled out in small, harmless teasing comments, but I didn't let it stop there. I was, and still am, a person triggered by success, by hearing people say how capable I am, how impressed they are that I take such responsibility and demonstrate such skill in my profession. And in contrast, Daniel's task seemed almost ridiculous to me. I went from feeling grateful to feeling contemptuous. And the worst part is that I noticed I somewhat enjoyed humiliating him. Maybe not at first, but after a while it crept in. It's so strange to admit, but there was a bizarre satisfaction in watching him try to please me by cooking an extra fancy dinner or making an extra effort to clean the house, only for me to shrug my shoulders and say, I would have preferred something else. Or when he had booked a family activity and I simply said, I don't have time, I have work. Maybe you can take Ava by yourself. I knew I was hurting him, but it gave me a weird sense of power, as if it confirmed my superiority. But none of this really exploded until I met Dr. Andrew Collins. Andrew was, and is, a senior physician at the hospital. He's 45, charismatic and successful, and exudes a confidence I hadn't seen in many others around me. He appeared in my life as my boss and mentor, and I instantly felt a strong attraction. At first, I tried to convince myself it was purely professional admiration, that he was a role model because he was so skilled. But it quickly turned into something else, something more personal and definitely more sexual. He complimented my work, talked to me about how he saw a future for me at the hospital, how I could climb even higher, how I had the potential to become one of the hospital's most successful doctors within a few years. I love hearing things like that. I thrive on that kind of validation. It started with slight touches on my shoulder, the way he leaned toward me when we talked in the corridors, his glances that sought eye contact in a way I wasn't used to. I felt chosen. I began pushing myself even harder at work because I wanted to impress him, let him see that I was truly someone to be reckoned with. And as my relationship with Andrew deepened, I became even more distant from Daniel. I remember sometimes sitting in the car on my way home after a long day thinking, why am I even going home? Why can't I just stay at the hospital or go to Andrew? I couldn't stand the thought of coming home to Daniel's timid smile and Ava jumping into my arms. Sure, I love Ava, but I felt more at home among adults, among ambitious people, among doctors and bosses than I did with my own family. Some days, Andrew and I spoke very openly. We ended up in a kind of intimate dialogue about our lives. He's married, but his wife lives in another city because of her own job. Apparently, she's someone important at her company. They apparently don't see each other often, and he has a somewhat lukewarm view of marriage, or at least that's what I gathered. He hinted he was tired of pretending to be happily married and that he longed for something real. He called it passion, but he also said he longed for someone like me. That is, hungry, driven, not content with a mediocre life. I rather quickly understood what it was all about. Our first truly close encounter was when we were sitting in his office after work, going over a difficult patient record. I remember how he suddenly leaned over and kissed me, in the middle of a sentence about some medication dosage. I acted surprised, but I'd been craving that moment for weeks. I kissed him back immediately, without hesitation. It was almost a euphoric feeling of transgression, of power. I felt alive in a way I hadn't in a long time in my marriage. Cheating on Daniel didn't even feel terrible. I know it sounds cold, but I saw him as a non-participant in my real life, some kind of supporting figure in the background, not a partner on equal footing. I recall thinking, he doesn't understand what I'm going through. He doesn't get my motivations. It was easy to blame him, to think that his lack of ambition didn't deserve my loyalty. It's hard now, in retrospect, to really understand how I could be so cold, but at the time it seemed perfectly logical. No alarm bell went off. I wasn't too worried about being caught. I suspected Daniel wouldn't notice anything anyway. He was so naive, so maddeningly trusting. Things escalated further when we had a conference trip planned. Andrew was giving a presentation, and I was invited as a sort of sidekick to present part of the research I'd been involved in. It was the first time Andrew and I would spend an entire weekend together outside the hospital. I lied at home and said I had to leave early Friday morning, even though the official conference started on Saturday morning. That gave us an extra full day alone. We checked into the hotel, and it was a strange feeling to do it publicly, yet still know that we each had our own room booked under the conference, while in reality we'd be sharing a bed. That day, that evening, it was as if all inhibitions within me vanished. We had dinner together, drank wine, talked for hours about our ambitions, our dreams, what we despised in our respective marriages. I indulged in criticizing Daniel. He doesn't do anything worthwhile. He's just a glorified housekeeper, I heard myself say, and Andrew nodded sympathetically. I felt validated. Yes, you deserve someone on your level, not someone walking around in sweatpants wiping a kid's runny nose. Andrew said it outright. What do you even see in him? And I had no real answer. Probably nothing anymore. That night we slept together, and I woke up next to Andrew with a mix of euphoria, triumph, and a tinge of guilt. But the guilt was so faint I could barely identify it. I remember thinking, serves Daniel right. He's got everything handed to him on a plate and still can't be man enough to earn his own money. That I use the word man enough is interesting in itself because I never used to define a man's value in that way, but I had really started looking down on him. When I came home from the conference on Sunday evening, I was greeted by a beaming Ava who ran into my arms squealing, "Mommy, Mommy, you're home!" And Daniel, who smiled somewhat tensely and asked how the trip had been. I felt no warmth inside when I hugged Ava, more a sense of relief that my secret was still safe. Daniel had prepared dinner, lit candles, and bought a bouquet of flowers. He talked about how much Ava had missed me, and I remember feeling even more contempt for him for that romantic gesture. I thought, how desperate he is. Does he think flowers are enough to compensate for the fact that he's a loser? I tossed out a comment like, flowers are nice, but it would have been enough if you'd kept the place tidy. I see the sink is full of dishes. What have you been doing all weekend? He answered somewhat apologetically that he and Ava had been out a lot, visited a play area, and met Sarah and Jessica with their kids. So you've had time to hang out with the mom group but haven't gotten around to doing the dishes, was my snide remark. I watched him shrink inside, watched the joy fade from his eyes. And to be honest, it gave me a sort of dark, perverse pleasure to see him hurt, as if I wanted him to understand that I no longer put him on a pedestal. Days, weeks, months went by. I continued my affair with Andrew in secret, while growing increasingly cold toward Daniel. Sometimes he'd invite me to talk about how we were doing. He said he was worried about our relationship, that maybe we should go to couples therapy, that he wanted to work on rekindling our closeness. But I literally laughed when he mentioned therapy. I said, "You think I want to waste my valuable time listening to some psychologist who thinks they know better than me? I'm a doctor. I don't need some hobby therapy." It was a way to dismiss him entirely, to make him feel like his suggestion was ridiculous. Inwardly, I was probably afraid of what a couples therapist might uncover, but I brushed that feeling aside and clung to my contempt instead. I also started criticizing his friends. He was still regularly in touch with two old college buddies, John and Mike. They'd occasionally meet up at a bar or watch a soccer game. I began giving him passive-aggressive comments. "Oh, going out drinking again, are you? After all, I'm the one who makes the money, so I guess you can afford to go out and have fun." Meanwhile, I actually knew he rarely drank more than a beer or two, and that they just wanted a break from family life. He probably needed that, but I didn't want to give him an inch of freedom. I wanted him to feel dependent and worthless, to know that I was the important one in our relationship. All the while, my affair grew more intense. Andrew spoke about how he was increasingly drawn to me, how he loved my ambition and intellect. It was as if he was turned on by me being married and still choosing him. I recall feeling a huge sense of power in choosing Andrew, a power I had never felt in my relationship with Daniel. Where Daniel was soft, insecure, constantly eager to avoid conflict, Andrew was tough, confident, direct. I never had to worry about hurting Andrew. He wasn't fragile like that. And he dominated the room when he walked in, just as I wanted to do. I remember one evening when I came home very late. I had been working, supposedly, but in reality, Andrew and I had been in a hotel room downtown. It was a hectic, passionate night. When I got home, Daniel was sitting up on the couch. I could see the fear in his eyes when he asked why I was so late. I lied about an emergency patient case requiring my presence. He nodded quietly, but I saw how his gaze flickered. It was as if he sensed something. He wasn't stupid after all. When I then went to shower, I heard him padding around in the hallway as if he wanted to say something else but didn't dare. He was always afraid of confrontation. I felt a deep contempt for his anxious manner. It was as if I thought, say something, demand an explanation, show some damn backbone. But he didn't. Instead, he went to bed. And I fell asleep seething with anger in my chest, anger directed at both him and myself, but mostly at him. Maybe it was inevitable that I would continue to push him down until it all broke completely. His self-esteem was already plummeting, and I struck like a viper whenever I got the chance. I criticized how he cleaned, how he did the laundry. I said things like, "No wonder you don't have a real job if you can't even sort laundry properly." Sometimes he became defensive and said, "But I'm doing my best. It's not that easy to handle everything with Ava around." And I scoffed. "Yeah, because it's so difficult to take care of a child. Imagine, I managed just fine when I was younger, so I guess I was more competent than you." I could bring up my own childhood, how my mother took care of me while working part-time, as if it was self-evident that he, too, should manage to work and do everything at home. I completely ignored the fact that I was the one who originally encouraged him to stop working to support my career. I noticed he was getting increasingly depressed. He talked less, laughed less. When we were in the same space at home, the atmosphere was often tense, but I couldn't feel much sympathy. I was too absorbed in my own life. Andrew and I kept making plans, seeking new career opportunities, maybe even moving to another city. We spoke in veiled terms about how we'd handle our respective marriages. He said he wasn't ready for a divorce, and I understood that his status in the hospital world could be affected if he suddenly found himself at the center of a scandal. But he tempted me with visions of the future. Think about when we can be an official couple, when we can work together openly, when we don't have to sneak around. And I was enticed by that future. I wanted to be by his side, not because I was deeply in love. It should be noted that I mostly felt a strong physical attraction and admiration for his success, but because I felt I deserved someone who was my equal, someone who could meet me on the same level. During this period of distance between Daniel and me, Ava started sensing something was off. She was only 4, but children aren't stupid. She saw that I was almost never home. She also saw that sometimes I snapped at her dad with a tone she didn't recognize. She started asking, "Mommy, are you mad at Daddy?" And I didn't know how to answer. Sometimes I said, "No, I'm just tired." Sometimes I said, "It's nothing you need to worry about. Go play." I saw her little worried face, and part of me felt guilty. But that same part quickly dismissed it with, "She's only 4. She'll forget this soon." One evening, I heard Ava trying to comfort Daniel. They were in the living room. I was in the kitchen. I snuck over and heard her say, "Daddy, why are you sad?" in her little bright voice. Daniel replied, "I'm not sad, sweetheart. I'm just a bit tired." His voice caught. Ava patted his cheek. My stomach tightened a bit, but in that same moment, I chose to walk away, as if I didn't want to acknowledge it. I had my own things to do, new reports to write, new meetings to plan. And Andrew was sending messages that stroked my ego. It was only a matter of time before everything exploded. Daniel wasn't stupid. He suspected something was wrong, and sometimes he tried to snoop through my phone. I was usually careful. I deleted messages, erased emails. I lied regularly about late nights at the hospital. But one evening, I forgot to delete a chat with Andrew. It wasn't super explicit, but there were phrases indicating our relationship was intimate. Daniel found it and confronted me. I remember that evening clearly. I came through the front door and he was standing in the hallway, holding my phone in his hand. He looked upset, but also determined, as if he'd finally mustered the courage to fight. "What is this?" he said in a trembling voice, holding up the phone. I snapped, "That's my private phone. Who gave you the right to snoop?" He raised his voice, something he rarely did. "I had no choice. I've suspected this for a long time, but you've lied about late nights. You've been absent. He looked like he might cry, but he held it together. "You're cheating, Rebecca, and you treat me like crap." I stood there silent for a moment. I felt a wave of anger. How dare he accuse me when he was the weak figure? I shouted back, "You forced me into this. You don't give me anything I need. You're just at home, you're not developing, you're not a real man." He stared at me with an expression of shock and despair. I saw how he seemed to deflate. And yet I turned around and walked into the kitchen without continuing the discussion. I was so angry I couldn't form clear thoughts. But at the same time, I felt a malicious satisfaction at finally being able to shout those words. Words that had echoed in my head for a long time. "You're not a real man." Daniel followed me. He said, "Rebecca, can't we just try to fix this if it's possible?" I spun around, glared at him, and said icily, "There's nothing to fix. I don't want to be married to an unambitious stay-at-home dad. I want someone who works as hard as I do." I didn't pull any punches. He didn't say anything else. He just sank onto a chair and looked empty. I left the room and went into the bedroom, slammed the door, and thought I couldn't take it anymore. After that night, he never called me sweetheart again. A few days of silence passed, and then he got straight to the point. I want a divorce. I felt both relief and a sting of discomfort. Relief because I no longer had to pretend or hide anything. Discomfort because it meant I actually had to face the consequences of everything I'd done. I was also unsure how Andrew would react, as I hadn't planned on a divorce at that moment. And after all, divorcing would make my life significantly more complicated, especially concerning Ava. Who would look after her when I worked even more? Daniel had previously been the one who took care of it all, but I kept my composure and said cockily, "Fine, so we're on the same page." The following weeks were chaos. Daniel packed up some of his things and moved out. He arranged a temporary apartment. Ava was confused, but Daniel explained simply that Mommy and Daddy need to live apart for a while. I let him handle the difficult part. I didn't have the time or energy to sit down with Ava and explain. I was entirely consumed by my own situation, but I barely had time to breathe before realizing how dependent I was on Daniel for the household and our daughter. Suddenly, I had to arrange babysitters, plan preschool pickups, make dinner for a tired 4-year-old. I did it halfway decently, but I noticed my efficiency at work dropping. I could no longer stay as late as I wanted because the preschool staff would call and ask when Ava would be picked up. I had to leave meetings and even surgeries. I'm sometimes a surgeon, and that's not something you skip lightly, which irritated my colleagues. At first, Andrew was accommodating, but he turned out not to be particularly interested in becoming a stepdad or even supporting me practically. He wanted me as a mistress, a partner in bed, and maybe a colleague at the hospital. But he didn't want a day-to-day life with a 4-year-old. I started feeling stressed and pressured. I sent increasingly frequent texts to Daniel, asking him to pick Ava up or watch her or come help with something. Initially, he was chilly, but he couldn't say no to caring for Ava. He loves her with all his heart. So Daniel began showing up at our old house. Well, it was still my house. Legally, it would be split, but I stayed there to take care of Ava. Sometimes he stayed for several hours. I worked late, came home, and found him there with Ava. They'd be watching TV or reading a book. When I entered, he said nothing accusing. He just stood up and quietly said, "She's already eaten. I'm going now." Sometimes I tried small talk, maybe out of guilt, but he responded briefly. He was never rude, but he was definitely not concerned about my well-being. Perhaps he was simply burnt out. Yet he was there when I needed him. The contrast to Andrew was striking. Andrew would only reach out when he wanted to meet at the hospital or if he was alone in his office. I began to realize that if I wanted a lasting relationship with Andrew, I'd have to forfeit my time with Ava entirely. He saw no place for her in his life. One day it hit me. Good God, I ruined my marriage chasing someone who doesn't even want a real life with me. I felt an icy grip around my heart. I started missing Daniel. Not in the sense that I longed to hug him, but I missed the security he provided, that stable embrace I'd once been able to fall back on. I missed how he always stepped up, how he used to look at me with admiration. That look was gone now. I could barely meet his gaze. The divorce moved forward. Papers had to be signed, we split our belongings and finances. On some days, I tried apologizing. I called him and said, "I'm sorry for everything I did. I know I was cruel to you, and now I realize it." He responded briefly, "I don't know if it matters anymore." I swallowed my pride and tried to explain I didn't mean everything I said, that I'd been blinded by my career and ambition. But he wasn't receptive. He'd been hurt too many times. I couldn't blame him, but it pained me. For the first time in months, I felt something other than anger and contempt for him. I felt longing mixed with shame. I clearly saw that if he hadn't sacrificed his own opportunities, hadn't taken care of Ava and the household the way he did, I'd never have become this successful. I'd never have been able to take all those late shifts, jump on all those research projects, conferences, or extra work. At the same time, I felt trapped. My job still demanded everything of me. I got harsh criticism in my department because I sometimes had to leave early to pick up Ava, and there were times I arrived late or was unfocused in meetings because I had to arrange childcare. Andrew started complaining that I was no longer as focused as before. He hinted that maybe I should choose either fully commit to the hospital or let someone else take over some of my responsibilities. But I wasn't ready to give up my career under any circumstances. However, I began to doubt that Andrew and I had a future together. We started arguing more. He said I was difficult and that he never intended a relationship that involved parental responsibilities. I said he was selfish. Our relationship was on very shaky ground. During that time, I took desperate measures. I called Daniel and asked for more help, asked him to pick Ava up more often, maybe even stay at my place occasionally so I could work nights. He didn't protest loudly. He mostly seemed resigned. But he stepped up for our daughter's sake. Sometimes when I had to be away overnight, he'd come and sleep in the guest room. I experienced the absurdity of us living together despite being in the middle of a divorce. I'd see him in the kitchen feeding Ava breakfast when I came home from a night shift. Then I'd kiss Ava goodbye and drag myself off to bed while Daniel took her to preschool. When I woke up, he was gone. It felt like a paid nanny, except without pay, with no real gratitude on my part. I was ashamed, but too exhausted to do anything about it. Paradoxically, Daniel seemed happy to spend so much time with Ava. It was as if he didn't really care about my presence. He was just happy to be near his child. He sometimes cleaned a bit while he was there, made her lunch, made sure the laundry was done. So I slid back into dependence on him. I didn't know how long I could exploit the situation, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't bear the thought of being alone with all the responsibility. Andrew had withdrawn more and more, and I sensed the end of our affair. He was sick of the drama, and I struggled to prioritize him when I needed to be there for Ava. The perfect relationship I thought I had with Andrew disintegrated. When the divorce was formally finalized, it was a strange day. I had taken a couple of hours off to sign the papers. Daniel was there, calm and collected. I was nervous and on edge. I remember glancing at him, thinking, how did everything go so wrong? After signing, we sat in the waiting room for a moment. I couldn't meet his eyes, but I mustered the courage to whisper, "I'm sorry." He didn't respond. Then we went our separate ways. Later that same evening, I called him, even though I knew it might be foolish. I said I wanted to meet and talk everything through. He sounded tired, but agreed. We met at my place, where Ava was already asleep. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and he sat across from me. I said, "I know I've destroyed so much. I know I've treated you horribly. I truly regret everything. I wish I could take it all back." He didn't say anything, just nodded slightly. I continued, "I don't want you to forgive me right now, but I hope that one day we can be friends, for Ava's sake, if nothing else. I still love you in some way, even though I don't know how to show it." I heard how pathetic I sounded, but I meant it. Daniel looked at me, and I saw his eyes fill with tears. He took a deep breath and said, "Rebecca, I've loved you for so many years. I've done everything to support you, to be what you needed. But nothing has been enough. I don't know if I can heal from what you've done. Not yet. I'm sorry." It was the first time I truly felt I had lost him, that he was no longer my backup plan or my reliable safety net. I didn't want to cry in front of him, but I did anyway. I sobbed and begged for another chance, but he said, "No, not now. Maybe never." Then he got up and left. I tried to continue with my job, but the pressure mounted. I had no one to rely on the way I used to, and Andrew was no longer passionately interested in me. I tried to salvage our relationship, but he said, "This isn't sustainable. I don't want drama." Eventually, that too fell apart. At work, colleagues noticed I wasn't as sharp. Emma Carter, my childhood friend who is also a doctor at the same hospital, tried to talk to me. She said she was worried that I looked tired, that I wasn't myself. I dodged the issue and blamed stress, but she probably suspected something else was going on. Slowly, I began to realize I was alone. I had neither Daniel nor Andrew. My daughter loved me, but I wasn't really present for her. I tried to get organized so I could handle joint custody, but it was difficult. Daniel got a better apartment and made sure Ava had her own room there. When she stayed with him every other week, I felt a wrenching emptiness. I wanted to call and talk to her, but I was afraid she'd sense how fake I sounded. Daniel let her answer the phone every time, and hearing her voice made me realize how unimaginably much I had ruined. After a few months of this life, with shared custody, I decided to take it seriously. I took a week off, something I never thought I'd do, and slowed down so I could spend time with Ava. During that week, I realized how much work Daniel must have put in over the years, how demanding but also how rewarding it can be to be a full-time parent. I felt more humble about his efforts than ever before, but of course it was too late. We were already divorced. Now I'm sitting here alone at the kitchen table. The divorce is final. Daniel picks up Ava every Friday afternoon to have her for the weekend. I still work at the hospital, but with more limited hours because I can't handle all those extra shifts without falling apart. Andrew is just a colleague, nothing more. Sometimes I see him in the hallway. He gives me a nod and a polite smile, and I feel only emptiness. Every time Daniel picks up Ava, I see in his eyes that he's moved on in some way. Maybe not to a new relationship, but he has a new outlook on life where I no longer have a place. Sometimes I try to start a conversation, maybe ask if he wants to come in, but he declines. He's friendly but firm. I hear he's been hanging out with his old college friends again, and I'm surprised at how jealous I get. Why should I care? I chose my own path. I chose to look down on him. I chose to cheat on him. I chose to destroy our relationship. Now I can't help but cry when I think about it all. I understand that I was driven by a blind pursuit of validation and success, and on the way, I trampled Daniel's self-esteem until he had no choice but to stand up and leave. I can't help but wonder how things would have turned out if I'd only acknowledged to myself that his role was invaluable, that the security he gave me was the foundation for my success. Without him, everything is much harder. There's no one behind the scenes to pick Ava up, to handle the household, to cook dinner. I have to do it all myself, or pay for services Daniel once provided for free and with love. I'm still trying to cling to some bit of hope. Maybe one day Daniel will see that I've changed. Maybe we can slowly build some kind of understanding, at least for Ava's sake. I want to believe it's possible. I find it hard to believe he'll ever fully forgive me, but I don't want to stop trying. I want to show him that I can be a better person, a better mother, and maybe one day, a better partner. But right now, he's certain. He's done with me. He says he's lost all trust and that he's better off without me. I understand him. I understand it more than he thinks. I've seen my own dark side, how cruel I can be to the one who loved me most. I'm left with a feeling of shame and loneliness, but also a determination not to sink into self-pity. I'm still doing well at work, though I've reduced my pace. I've learned a hard lesson. Success means nothing without inner security, without someone to share it with. And I've learned it's never worth stepping on other people, even if you feel stronger, better, more successful. So when I see Daniel go out the door, hand in hand with Ava, and I'm standing there in the hallway, all I want to do is shout that I wish we could rewind time.
If you liked this story, please subscribe and give us a thumbs up. It helps a lot, and you won't miss out on any future stories. Take care and live your best life.